That's right. Great. Hi. Thank you all for being here. As said, my name is Harrington. I'm currently a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm going to be presenting a paper called On Buddhist Frogs and Flower Arrangement out of Games, Spatial Production and Friendship Games. The title changed a little bit from the conference proceedings, so for that I deeply apologize, but it's not very different. So it's still very similar. So let's go. So when I talk about friendship games, I'm specifically talking about games that have been theorized before and I'll be mentioning by who, where on one hand the games are oriented around the idea of making friends with non-playable characters and the generally very happy feeling of everything going very smoothly and organic and natural. But on the other hand, the core gameplay loop tends to be very neo-capitalistic, where it's oriented around collecting things and doing things with these collections, which in turn incites you to collect more things and doing more things with these collections. A few examples of these games would be games like Tabikaeru, also known as Journey Frog, which is somewhere over there. The top game is Animal Crossing, part of the franchise in general, all of it. And there's also Neka Atsume. So if you've played these games, you could have a general idea. If you haven't played these games, here's an example. One of my favorite of these, and it's more recent, is Tabikaeru. Its core gameplay loop, as explained, is somewhere a game where you have to collect clovers, and with these clovers you buy travel items for your frog, which incites different types of journeys for your frog. After you buy him these travel items, your frog goes on a journey and has lots of fun. And while he's having fun, you collect more clovers, which allows you to buy different travel items, so your frog can go on different types of journeys. I, along with a lot of other people, are not sure how these items influence your frog's journeys, simply because the game is completely in Japanese. Recently, a Chinese company released a game in Chinese as well, but there isn't a version in English yet. So I just buy him things so he can go to different places because it's adorable. And these are some of the postcards that he gives you after he goes on different travels. And this is what people tend to comment about on this game. While if we're talking about a first-person shooter, most people will be talking about, oh, the gameplay mechanics are really solid, you point your gun at someone and it shoots their head, it works really well. Within these games, people are not really talking about the core gameplay mechanic, where they're talking about the idea that, oh, collecting clover so I can buy travel items for this frog is really interesting. Instead, they're talking about their perceived relationship with the frog and his friends. So for example, in Chinese, it's very often called, excuse my Chinese, Fosi Yanghua, which basically means Buddhist frog. And because they perceive that there's a slight meditative quality to this frog, where him going to different places is soothing and relaxing to them, and they experience a sense of sonder from this frog. The idea that him going to different places and meeting different friends is a kind of journey that they're not taking, and they enjoy seeing him meet very interesting people like Big Moth, which are characters you will never interact with within the game except within these postcards. So my question is, why does the core gameplay mechanic, which is very capitalistic, very aggressive, very get stuff to do stuff, very different from the way people experience this game? Now, as many of you might know, that's not a very new argument. I hope to bring something new to it. Bogus in 2008-2013 argued about the idea of consumerism versus naturalism in Animal Crossing games. He argued that on one hand the game is very consumer-oriented, you're buying stuff so that you can make a bigger house, and then you get a bigger house so you can buy more stuff for your big house. But on the other hand, the animals within the game are very naturalistic. They just want to walk around and do things, and they experience life with a sense of what he phrases inveterate longing, a phrase I really enjoy. And he phrases this as simulation fever, which is an internal crisis wrought by the game's rules and the player's subjective response to them. On the other hand, more recently, Scully Blaker talked about the idea of radical slowness, and again he was talking about the over-productive nature of capitalism within these games. Animal Crossing's core gameplay loop is encouraging you to just get more bells, so you can buy that really nice furniture. But sometimes, as a way of critical play, some people do not follow this core gameplay loop. For example, he mentions an example where he sits down on a bench and just waits for a bit because this was a very pretty view. And he sees this as a form of critical gameplay because he's challenging the main dominant culture within the game to enforce what he feels is a more matching aesthetic quality. So, on the other hand, I'm going to try and add something to this by introducing Lefebvre's ideas of production of space and arguing why this introduction might be necessary to this discussion. So, Lefebvre divides his production of space into three different things. He divides into spatial practice, representations of space, and representational space. I'll be mostly focusing on the former and the latter, but there might be space for the second as well. So, spatial practice, he argues, is space as perceived. It is the way society is built in a certain way so that it perpetuates the dominant culture within that space. Not only does it perpetuate it, but it also masters it. It's a constant feedback loop of things happening, tying back to the dominant culture within society. On the other hand, representational space is lived. This is not the space for the dominant culture, but rather for the dominated culture. Instead, here, people that do not exist within the space, through images and symbols, can appropriate the space to mean something different and something new. And they utilize it in ways that match more what they want out of the space. To give an example of this, let me see if I was, I don't know. To give an example for this, looking at the office space. The office space is designed in a very particular way. It's designed, for example, the cubicle office space is designed to be divided in a particular way to show the segmentation of people from each other, and compartmentalize their work, but also designed in a way that it's emphasizing the production of the space. People exist within their space to produce more for that space. However, somebody might place a picture of their family within that space, and all of a sudden that space gains a new type of representational meaning. That space now also signifies their strive to earn for the family and strive for something bigger. Games are not very different. The way games are designed perpetuates the spatial practices within these spaces. Game design is done in a very particular way to perpetuate what the designers want that space to recreate. And in the case of friendship games, it's also perpetuating society at large. It's not simply just perpetuating a design choice, but also perpetuating the main political ideologies that have capitalistic consumption and reproduction. This is something that Crawford also argues, especially in response to previous writings about game studies. Crawford argues that applying Lefebvre should be more of a look at a schema rather than a taxonomy. Argues that previous conceptions of digital game spaces using Lefebvre tend to focus on saying a particular type of thing is a representation of space, while he argues that every space in itself can have all these different types of meanings, and we shouldn't ignore that society games existence within society at large. And relating to this, he also applies Lefebvre for societal readings rather than textual readings. He argues that instead of focusing on player-centric approaches to Lefebvre, it might be more productive to focus on Lefebvre's larger Marxist context, where we're applying Lefebvre's ideas to the idea that games exist within a larger culture that's being produced and we are also producing into. He argues that perhaps leisure is a means of alienation that we shouldn't ignore, and this is a way of showing how digital games themselves are perpetuating this. If leisure is a means of alienation, it's also perpetuating the idea that there's a separation between play and work that perhaps we're not quite attuned to. He specifically uses the example of sports games, where he argues that sport games are themed spaces around sports as a means of simulating control for people. So, if you're in a game of FIFA, for example, you have shooting 93, passing 87 on a particular player. This is a way of simulating control over sporting achievements that you can't quantify, but we want to know their exact values so that we can think about these ways in a way we control them, and we can think about them and visualize them and have complete control of the means of production. But this is just a way of alienating us from the idea that we don't have control over these things, sports-wise or otherwise, within actual space. So, yes. Give me a second. Yes. I'm empathetic to this general view, this idea that Lefebvre's work should not be viewed as taxonomical but rather schematic, and the idea of play as a alienation from our normal society. What I would add to this is perhaps that Crawford stops a little bit short and focuses only on the way games reproduce spatial production, and there perhaps can be a way of looking at how games can also be spaces lived. In my previous example, it becomes pretty clear how the core gameplay loop within these games perpetuates the space's proceeds, the space's spatial practice. However, I would argue that there are ways outside of this that we can look at it. So, for example, in Bogus and Scully Blaker's previous examples, this was particularly clear. The neo-capitalistic nature of these game design choices perpetuates the neo-capitalism that exists within our society. However, perhaps you can look at meaning that can be generated outside of this procedure, and in what I will term the out-of-game. Now, before I move in there, Lefebvre argues that there are two ways of seeing the representation of space. One way he describes this through the writings of philosophers and people that aim to do nothing but describe the space that they live within, and the other way he argues, which is the one I shall be focusing on, is through the interpersonal relations that people share with each other, and the meaning that they create through interpersonal relationships. Now, before I move further on with this, I think it's a little bit important to create a distinction between digital game and game, to see where this interpersonal relation might exist. In Crawford's paper, he defines games as something where life turns into calculations, where choices in games are goal-oriented and rationalized, and gamers are turned into information economy workers. And perhaps here it is important to create a distinction between the digital game space itself and the game core loop, the game mechanic. When I use the word game from now on, I'm going to be using it in terms of the core gameplay loop, the part where he talks about life as calculations, things that you can calculate and move on with. While the digital game is the space around it, it's the thing that we normally approach for textual analysis. And I argue that perhaps the best space to look at these analysis for the space as lived is through the out-of-game, where we're looking outside of the game, the core gameplay loop, but instead looking within the digital game, inside the digital game textual space, to see how we can create interpersonal relations with other people. So, I realize also I'm going a bit too fast, so I'll slow down a bit. One way is through a way of that's independent of the game and also independent of the digital game. So it doesn't exist within the core gameplay loop, but it also is not emphasized through the digital game itself. So for example, Tabekairu's postings on social medias, and here I'm going to make a small reference to Sicard's idea that solitaire games are not necessarily solitary games. There is a game to be played in Tabekairu. People approach it by doing the core gameplay loop that is asking you to do, which in turn gives us things for you to repeat. However, the core takeaway for players in these games doesn't happen within the game core gameplay loop, nor does it happen within the digital game space that it exists within, but rather it happens within the social media postings. People are describing meaning to things that are happening that are not even existing within the digital game space. Within WeChat, for example, the main social media platform in China, people discuss what the animals are doing, even though this isn't reproduced in any way within the digital game space. There are stories oriented around the frog and the crab in particular, which is a nice coupling, that are not reproduced in any way in the game, except for, I think, 4 or 5 photos, but they make this a much larger thing. They're not existing within the digital game space itself, but interpersonal meaning for players is generated outside of this digital game space, but of course encouraged by the digital game space itself. There's also a way of this happening independent of the core gameplay loop, but dependent on the digital game. For example, while playing Animal Crossing, one of my favorite activities was not actually doing the core gameplay loop, but but rather inviting a particular friend of mine over to look at my beautiful flower garden. Now, the flower garden within Animal Crossing doesn't really follow the core gameplay loop at all, because it doesn't give you money, it doesn't even sell for money, and these items are not interactable in any way. I just place them there for my own aesthetic value. They don't really perpetuate the game's condition in any way. However, by inviting someone over there, and then me also going within their space, we could share our experiences of our gardens together, how pretty they are. This is not my garden, but I would hazard to say mine is prettier. But anyway, I'm inviting them to my space, going to use their space, and we're creating an interpersonal bond where the meaning of these flower gardens is not dependent on the core gameplay loop, but rather the value we give it as something that we think is aesthetically pretty and we're recreating within the digital game. And finally, another way is one that's dependent on the core gameplay loop but exists outside of it, and one that's also dependent on the digital game space. This is something I talked a little bit briefly in a previous conference at Digra. For example, in Animal Crossing New Leaf, the animals have an indigenous language to themselves, which they perform with each other and exist within the space within the game. However, and this has meaning within the game because it also shows you that perhaps there's a little bit of a degree of separation between you and the non-playable characters. However, at the same time, it's also something that is not completely meaningful. The meaning that I ascribe at least to this indigenous language is that it showed me that there is a bit of a background in the lore that perhaps isn't emphatically stated, but it's clearly there, and this creates an orientation around the space that perhaps we are not finely attuned to, but through discussing it with other people and looking at the hints that the game gives you, we can belong more to the space and see what meaning we can generate out of the clues that it gives us. To conclude, my main argument was basically that spatial practice is continuously propagated and shows our frustration with an alienated non-digital space. The core gameplay loop is encouraging this propagation of the space, and we participate in something different to try and vent our frustration. However, player value is generated not only in-game, but also interpersonally throughout out-of-game production. In these spaces, we can experience game space as lived, not only as game as perceived. While I feel that Crawford had a very good point to point out that spatial practice within digital games is very much present, and perhaps even the core takeaway from these games. The best way to find an example of out-of-game, the best way to find an example of spaces lived is through this out-of-game production. And this, I would argue, explains why such heavily neoliberalized spaces are still approached by the hardiest of lefties too, with positivity and the general happiness around it. Because they allow for substantial spaces lived production through the out-of-game meaning production. Thank you.
Questions? Okay, I have a question. So you used the word radical a couple of times. Radical softness, radical softness, radical stillness. Could you expand a little bit more on the extent to which you think that radicality pushes back? How successful can that pushback be?
I was mostly using it in terms of another person. So, as Sally Baker talks about this in terms of also Matisse's radical softness within queer studies. So I'm not really equipped to answer how much he feels that there's a pushback. I think I would hazard to say that perhaps he thinks the pushback is currently soft, but it becomes stronger the more it's performed as a critical way of engaging with the game. If critical engagement is solitary, that's very different than a lot of people responding to this critical engagement and also performing within it. But I'm not perhaps completely sure into how he would feel about this.
So if the say you talk about if the video games are made, so if the developer of the game designs this out-of-game sharing into it as a form of marketing, at what point does that become actually in-game, in fact?
My argument, there's a certain extent of it that is definitely still in-game, like the boundaries between these sort of things are very blurred. Perhaps, first of all, we necessitate the distinction again between the game and the game space, where when I'm talking about the out-of-game, I'm specifically talking to things outside of the gameplay loop. So I'm perfectly happy with acknowledging that some of the aspects are designed. What I'm arguing perhaps a bit more strongly in terms of Crawford's ideas and even mine is that most of the spatial production happens in terms of this core gameplay loop, and perhaps there is more space to create interpersonal meaning outside of this core gameplay loop. It's still designed, but perhaps there is more space for it. And there's also space for the core gameplay loop that is not designed by the designers themselves. So while Tabi Cairo is quite amenable to social media postings, some discussions that exist around games are not oriented around these, are not aided by the game itself. Like Tabi Cairo gives you postcards which you can share on social media very easily, so that aids the discussion. But a lot of discussion about games happens unmediated by the game. So it's also an avenue for interpersonal connection in terms of effect.
Was there another question?
Oh, I had the exact same question.
I was wondering though, these out-of-game spaces that these games allow for creating those interpersonal, like you say that they allow for very substantial, if you go back to that amount of out-of-game meaning production. Is that specific for only these friendship games? Is that like a casual game tendency, or do you see that it's the formal elements of the genre that makes them so suitable for that?
I would say so. I mostly focused on friendship games because the way I saw it is that Lefebvre's production of space was a scathing criticism of capitalism and the way capitalism produces spaces. So if I could get away with finding lived spaces within games which are practically capitalism with a friendly veneer, then perhaps other games would also find the space for this. In the full paper I also talk about one of the examples that Crawford gives. So Crawford focuses specifically on sports games and their theming. So if there's an out-of-game space for these, so he mostly talks about the values so that you give to players within sports games, which aren't quantifiable in real life, but it allows a sort of sense of control, like having Shooting 98. But if I switch FIFA on just to listen to the soundtrack, these spatial productions are still there. It's still been designed and the space is still being created and it's still there. However, the status quo is being maintained, but at the same time it's also not being propagated by my actions because I'm just listening to the music. So there's still space of out-of-game meaning production, and at least I remember in my childhood that was a big experience of FIFA games. I don't know how much it is anymore, but a big part of the experience was talking about the good music in the game with your friends. So it was also an avenue of ascribing meaning to these spaces that perhaps would be in the out-of-game realm.
Thank you.
So I want to talk about Animal Crossing because I would take any opportunity to do that.
I do that too.
Maybe to offer a slightly different reading of Animal Crossing and like its relation to this kind of neoliberal structure that you ascribe to, which is definitely there and definitely pushed towards you as the player as this is what you should be doing in the game. But on the other hand, the game also provides many, we can call them mechanics for want of a better word, which involve nothing more than wandering and sitting still. It gives you benches to sit on, and when you sit on the bench, nothing happens until you decide to get up, just like switches to this kind of panoramic view, right? Or when your neighbor decides to visit you at your house, right? They you do just nothing but let time pass in their company. And so a lot of the game is about doing nothing. And in a sense, maybe I wonder if it would be interesting to bring Pauline's paper from today into the conversation. Because another way to look at Animal Crossing as a baseline, it does give you this boredom, right? You do nothing. You walk around aimlessly, you hand out to people and so on. So it gives that kind of base or bare facticity, right? But it also provides that capitalist loop of accumulation as a means to escape that boredom. But you don't have to, right? You can perfectly well play Animal Crossing and not accumulate anything. I think you just do that because, again, kind of ideologically pushes that. That's what you should do. But I would think that being the baseline, perhaps.
I would agree with you in terms that Animal Crossing and perhaps even the other two give you a lot of space for this leeway of doing nothing, and there is a lot of space for this out-of-game production which perhaps they also made good examples for my general point, a little bit cherry-picked, in that yes, they give you a lot of avenue for doing nothing and a lot of mechanics, if you want to call them that orient around not doing much. But within the game structure itself, you gain meaning mostly from these things through the act of interpersonal relations and doing something out of them. The act of doing nothing itself is not perhaps inherently meaningful. It only becomes meaningful when you ascribe meaning to it. And this is perhaps where we would disagree. I don't think there's an act of meaning itself in sitting down in the game. The game doesn't enforce it as a way of meaning production, but it becomes a meaningful production as soon as you but as soon as you create something that you can engage with, either with discussions with other people or through it having a meaning for yourself. And that is where we can approach those spaces lived.
Very quick one.
It's just in relation to the last question. As I see it, these out-of-game meanings, these mini games and stuff and such, in relation to the other about boredom, I see it as we are in the second stage with those where we look after meaning and we look after if it's right that Animal Crossing has some quiet moments or some boring moments that we then describe meaning that we must be in the second stage where we still haven't got really bored and start reflecting on things. So maybe there is too many things less to do and to describe meaning, and therefore we don't get to quite the same level.
I'm not sure if that's what you mean by second stage. Does this relate to Ollie's paper?
Yeah.
Okay, I missed that paper, so it's a little bit lost on me. Sorry.
Right, then, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.